Hello there, and welcome back to another gentle journey through history. Tonight, we're going to slow things down and let our minds wander through one of the most fascinating stories ever told. The birth of a nation. Not through textbooks or dry dates, but through the quiet rhythm of storytelling, the kind that lets you drift while you learn something extraordinary. I want you to settle in wherever you are. Maybe you're lying in bed with the soft glow of your screen. Maybe you're curled up somewhere cozy, letting the world outside fade into background noise. Either way, we're going to take our time tonight. No rushing, no pressure to remember every detail. Just the slow, steady unfolding of how 13 small colonies on the edge of a vast continent somehow found the courage to tell the most powerful empire on Earth that they were done taking orders. This isn't the story you learned in school with its neat timelines and memorized facts. This is the human story, the one filled with ordinary people making extraordinary choices, with late-night conversations around flickering candles, with moments of doubt and flashes of brilliance that changed everything. Because before there was an America, there were just people. People who got tired of being told what to do, how to live, and what to believe. So, let your thoughts slow down to the pace of history itself. We're going back to a time when crossing the ocean meant months of uncertainty, when news travelled at the speed of horses, and when the idea of independence was so radical, so dangerous, that even thinking it out loud could get you hanged. This is the story of how the impossible became inevitable, told gently, told slowly, told in a way that lets you breathe and wonder, and maybe even dream. The year is 1763, and if you were standing on the docks of Boston or walking the streets of Philadelphia, you might think you were witnessing the peak of British power in North America. The French and Indian War has just ended, and Great Britain stands victorious, master of a continent that stretches from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The French are gone, the Spanish push back, and the 13 colonies that hug the eastern seaboard seem more British than ever. But something has shifted, something subtle and quiet that most people don't notice yet. For the first time in generations, the colonists don't need Britain's protection anymore. The French threat that kept them looking across the ocean for safety has vanished. And in that newfound security, something unexpected begins to grow. Not rebellion, not yet, but something quieter and more dangerous. Self-reliance. Picture a farmer in Virginia, working land that his grandfather cleared from wilderness. He's never seen London, never will, but for his entire life, he's been told that some distant king owns his loyalty, that decisions made in rooms he'll never enter should guide how he lives. For decades, this arrangement worked because it had to. The colonies needed protection, needed trade, needed the security that came with being part of something larger. But now, with the French gone and the frontier opening up, that farmer starts to wonder why he needs permission from strangers to live his life. It's the same wondering that touches a merchant in New York, counting coins that he earned through his own cleverness and hard work, only to watch a portion disappear into taxes that benefit people he's never met. It whispers to a craftsman in Philadelphia, whose hands shape wood and metal into useful things, who begins to question why laws written by men who've never held tools should govern how he practices his trade. This wondering spreads like morning mist, invisible but everywhere, touching every corner of colonial life. The British, of course, see none of this. From London, the colonies look like children who've grown a bit too comfortable, a bit too prosperous, and need reminding of their place. The war with France cost enormous sums of money, and it seems only reasonable that the colonists who benefited from British protection should help pay for it. What could be more logical than asking people to contribute to their own defence? And so, in 1764, Parliament passes the Sugar Act. Not a dramatic declaration of war, just a simple adjustment to trade regulations. Colonial merchants who import molasses will pay a bit more tax. It's reasonable, measured, the kind of administrative decision that fills government ledgers and rarely troubles anyone's sleep. But in the coffee houses of Boston and the taverns of Charleston, men begin to talk. Not about revolution, that word hasn't been whispered yet, but about fairness, about whether it's right for people who have no voice in Parliament to be taxed by Parliament. The talk is careful at first, almost apologetic. These are loyal British subjects after all, proud of their heritage and grateful for their freedoms. But the questions, once started, have a way of multiplying. If Parliament can tax molasses without asking the colonists, what else can they tax? If decisions about colonial trade can be made in London without colonial input, what other decisions might follow? The wondering deepens, and with it, something that will prove far more dangerous to the British Empire than any army. The colonists begin to think. The thinking spreads through letters and conversations, through sermons and newspaper articles. In Massachusetts, a lawyer named James Otis writes about the rights of Englishmen, about the ancient principle that free people cannot be taxed without their consent. In Virginia, a young firebrand named Patrick Henry stands in the House of Burgesses and speaks words that make older, more careful men shift uncomfortably in their seats. These aren't calls for rebellion, not yet, but there's something perhaps more dangerous. They're invitations to imagine a different way of being. The British response comes in 1765 with the Stamp Act, and suddenly the abstract becomes personal. Every legal document, every newspaper, every deck of cards must carry a stamp that costs money. The tax touches everyone, from the wealthy merchant who needs stamped papers for his contracts to the ordinary citizen who wants to read the news. It's efficient, comprehensive, and from London's perspective, perfectly reasonable. The colonists use British courts, British laws, British protection. Why shouldn't they pay for these services? But in the colonial mind, something fundamental has been violated. The stamp tax isn't just about money, it's about power. It says that distant legislators can reach into colonial pockets whenever they choose, that the consent of the governed is a luxury, not a right. In Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty begins meeting in secret. In New York, merchants organize boycotts. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses passes resolutions that dance right up to the edge of treason without quite crossing it. The resistance surprises everyone, including the colonists themselves. They discover that when they work together, when they coordinate their efforts across colony lines, they have power. The stamp tax becomes nearly impossible to collect, as tax collectors resign under pressure, and stamped paper sits unused in warehouses. British merchants, watching their American trade dry up, begin pressuring Parliament to reconsider. The impossible happens. The Stamp Act is repealed. The celebration that follows feels like vindication. The colonists proved that they could stand up for their rights and win. But the British draw a different lesson. They pass the Declaratory Act on the same day they repeal the Stamp Act, asserting Parliament's right to tax and legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It's a statement of absolute power, a line drawn in the sand that says the previous compromise was a matter of convenience, not principle. Both sides have now stated their positions clearly, though neither fully realizes it yet. The colonists believe they have the rights of Englishmen, including the right not to be taxed without representation. The British believe they have the authority to govern their empire as they see fit. These two beliefs cannot coexist forever, but for now, in the aftermath of the Stamp Act crisis, there's room for both sides to pretend that accommodation is possible. The pretense continues through 1767 with the Townshend Acts, which place taxes on glass, tea, paper, and other imported goods. The British congratulate themselves on their cleverness. These are external taxes, duties on trade. not the internal taxes that the colonists objected to with the Stamp Act. Surely this distinction will matter to people who claim to care so much about legal principles. But the colonists have moved beyond legal distinctions. They've discovered something that will reshape the world. They've learned that they can govern themselves. During the Stamp Act crisis, they organized resistance, coordinated between colonies, and made decisions that affected their common welfare. They've tasted self-determination, and the experience has changed them. The taxes themselves almost don't matter anymore. What matters is the principle behind them, the assumption that people in London have the right to make decisions for people in America. The resistance to the Townshend Acts is more sophisticated than before, more organised and more determined. Women organise spinning bees to make cloth rather than buy British textiles. Merchants enter into non-importation agreements that strangle British trade. In Boston, the situation grows tense as British customs officials try to enforce the new taxes, while crowds gather to intimidate them. The British send troops to restore order, and suddenly the abstract dispute about taxation becomes concrete and visible. Red-coated soldiers patrol the streets of Boston, a daily reminder that the colonists live under military occupation. On a cold March evening in 1770, the tension explodes. A crowd gathers around a British sentry, taunting him, throwing snowballs and chunks of ice. More soldiers arrive, and in the confusion and fear, shots are fired. 5 colonists lie dead in the snow, including Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American heritage, whose death makes him the first casualty of what will become the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as it quickly becomes known, changes everything and nothing. The British withdraw most of their troops and repeal most of the Townshend taxes, keeping only the tax on tea as a symbol of their authority. The crisis seems to pass, and for 2 years an uneasy peace settles over the colonies. Trade resumes, tensions cool, and many on both sides hope that the worst is over. But the quiet is deceptive. In the coffee houses and taverns, in the letters that pass between colonial leaders, in the pamphlets that circulate from hand to hand, the conversation continues. Men like Samuel Adams in Boston and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia are thinking, writing, and slowly building the intellectual framework for something that still has no name. They're reading John Locke and other philosophers who write about natural rights and the consent of the governed. They're studying history and law, looking for precedents and principles that might justify what they're beginning to imagine. The calm ends in 1773 with tea. The British East India Company is struggling financially, and Parliament passes the Tea Act to help by allowing the company to sell directly to American retailers, bypassing colonial merchants. It's not really a new tax, more like a corporate bailout with a side effect of reinforcing British authority. But to the colonists, it looks like favouritism and monopoly, another example of decisions made in London that hurt American interests. The response is swift and dramatic. In Charleston, tea sits rotting on the docks. In New York and Philadelphia, tea ships are turned away before they can unload. But it's Boston that provides the moment that everyone will remember. On the night of December 16, 1773, dozens of men disguised as Mohawk Indians board 3 tea ships and dump 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party is theatre, protest, and revolution, all rolled into one symbolic act that everyone understands immediately. The colonists aren't just refusing to pay taxes anymore, they're actively defying British authority. The British response is swift and severe. Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, which the colonists immediately rename the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor is closed until the tea is paid for. The Massachusetts colonial government is essentially dissolved, with British officials taking direct control. British officials accused of crimes can be tried in England rather than in colonial courts. And a new Quartering Act requires colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. The Intolerable Acts accomplish something that years of colonial resistance couldn't manage. They unite the colonies in opposition to British rule. Georgia might not care much about Boston's problems, but when Parliament can destroy one colony's government, it can destroy any colony's government. The threat is universal now, and so is the response. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gather in Philadelphia for what they call the First Continental Congress. It's a remarkable moment, really, when you think about it. Men who have never met, who represent different interests and different traditions, who speak with different accents and hold different beliefs about religion and trade and the proper role of government, somehow find common ground in their shared frustration with British policy. They meet in Carpenter's Hall, a modest building that seems almost too small to contain the weight of what they're attempting. These aren't revolutionaries, not yet. They're merchants and lawyers, planters and ministers, men who have prospered under British rule and have no desire to throw away everything they've built. But they've reached a point where doing nothing feels more dangerous than acting. The conversations that unfold over the next 7 weeks happen quietly, behind closed doors, in the careful language of men who know that their words might someday be used as evidence of treason. They debate, they argue, they compromise. Some want to petition the king directly, believing that if they can just explain their position clearly enough, reasonably enough, the misunderstanding can be resolved. Others have moved beyond petitions to something more confrontational, though they're still not ready to name it. What emerges from these discussions is a document that walks a careful line between loyalty and defiance. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances acknowledges the colonists' allegiance to the Crown while listing their complaints against Parliament. They agree to a comprehensive boycott of British goods, and perhaps most importantly, they agree to meet again if their grievances aren't addressed. That simple decision, to reconvene, transforms what might have been a one-time protest into an ongoing institution. The Congress sends their petition to London and settles in to wait for a response. But while they wait, something is happening in the countryside that will make their careful diplomacy irrelevant. In Massachusetts, ordinary people are taking matters into their own hands. They're forming militia companies, stockpiling weapons, and drilling on village greens. They call themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice, though most of them probably don't believe that fighting will actually come. The British authorities in Boston watch this military preparation with growing alarm. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, has detailed reports of weapon caches in the countryside. He knows that if violence does break out, these colonial militias could pose a real threat to his small garrison of professional soldiers. The smart thing, he decides, is to seize the weapons before they can be used. On the night of April 18th, 1775, British troops march out of Boston toward Concord, where intelligence reports indicate the colonists have hidden a significant arsenal. It's meant to be a quick surgical operation. Seize the weapons, arrest any rebel leaders they might find, and return to Boston before the countryside can organize a response. But the colonists have watchers everywhere, and word of the British movement spreads faster than the soldiers can march. Paul Revere and William Dawes ride through the darkness, alerting the militia companies along the route. By dawn, when the British reach Lexington, they find a small group of Minutemen waiting for them on the village green. Nobody knows who fired first. In the confusion and tension of that moment, with nervous soldiers facing determined farmers, a shot rings out. Then another. In seconds, the careful balance that has held for years collapses into chaos and gunpowder smoke. 8 colonists lie dead on Lexington Green when the firing stops. The British continue to Concord, where they find and destroy some weapons. But by then, the entire countryside is in motion. Militia companies converge from every direction, and as the British begin their march back to Boston, they find themselves running a gauntlet of colonial fire. Men shoot at them from behind stone walls and trees, from farmhouses and barns. The disciplined retreat becomes a desperate flight, and only the arrival of British reinforcements saves the expedition from complete disaster. By evening, when the exhausted British soldiers finally reach the safety of Boston, the news is already spreading throughout the colonies. The shooting has started. The careful petitions and reasoned arguments, the attempts at compromise and accommodation, all of it has been swept away by the smoke and blood of Lexington and Concord. The impossible has happened. Americans have fired on British soldiers, and British soldiers have fired back. The Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia just 3 weeks later, and the men who gather this time face a very different situation than their predecessors. The previous Congress could debate and petition and hope for reconciliation. This one must deal with the reality of war. British troops are besieged in Boston by thousands of colonial militia. Blood has been shed. There's no going back to the way things were. Yet even now, even with war already begun, the idea of independence remains unspoken. These are still British subjects who believe they're fighting for their rights as Englishmen, not for separation from England. They appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of what they optimistically call the Continental Army, but they also send one last petition to King George III, hoping against hope that he might intervene to stop the madness. The Olive Branch Petition, as it becomes known, is a masterpiece of diplomatic language that manages to be both humble and firm, loyal and defiant. The colonists profess their attachment to the Crown while cataloguing their grievances against Parliament. They beg the King to intercede, to use his authority to restore peace and harmony between Britain and America. It's their final attempt to solve the crisis within the framework of the British Empire. The King's response, when it finally comes, closes the door on reconciliation forever. Rather than considering the petition, George III declares the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. He authorizes the use of foreign mercenaries, Hessian soldiers, to help suppress the uprising. Most devastating of all, he places the colonies outside his protection, effectively making them enemies of the state rather than subjects seeking redress. The psychological impact of the King's rejection cannot be overstated. For generations, colonists have distinguished between Parliament, which they see as corrupt and overreaching, and the Crown, which they view as the ultimate source of justice and protection. Even as they fight British soldiers, many colonists cling to the hope that the King, if he truly understood their situation, would side with them against his ministers. When that hope dies, something fundamental shifts in the colonial mind. Through the fall and winter of 1775, the war grinds on without clear purpose or direction. The colonists lay siege to Boston while British reinforcements arrive by sea. Battles are fought in places like Bunker Hill, where colonial militia prove they can stand against professional soldiers, even in defeat. But what exactly are they fighting for? The restoration of their rights as British subjects? Some vague notion of self-government? The question hangs over every military council and every congressional debate. The answer begins to crystallize through the influence of a recent immigrant from England, a man named Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense appears in January 1776 and spreads through the colonies like wildfire. Paine writes in plain language that ordinary people can understand, and his message is radical in its simplicity. The problem isn't bad policies or corrupt ministers. The problem is kingship itself, the very idea that one man should rule over millions by accident of birth. Common Sense sells over 100,000 copies in its first 3 months, an extraordinary number for a population of just 2.5 million. More importantly, it changes how people think about their situation. Paine doesn't argue for better treatment within the British Empire. He argues that the empire itself is illegitimate, that free people should govern themselves, that independence isn't just possible, but necessary. The pamphlet gives voice to thoughts that have been growing in colonial minds for months. If the King has rejected their petitions, if Parliament refuses to acknowledge their rights, if British soldiers are killing Americans in American towns, then what obligation do Americans have to remain British? For the first time, independence stops being unthinkable and starts being inevitable. The momentum builds through the spring of 1776. One by one, colonial assemblies begin instructing their delegates to Congress to support independence. It's a gradual process, different in each colony, as local leaders gauge the mood of their constituents and find the courage to take an irreversible step. Virginia acts first, instructing its delegates not only to support independence, but to propose it. North Carolina follows, then others, until by early summer, the question isn't whether Congress will declare independence, but when and how. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rises in Congress and offers a resolution that changes everything. That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The words are simple, but they carry the weight of revolution. Lee isn't asking for better treatment or reformed policies. He's proposing to sever the political connection between America and Britain to create something entirely new in the world. A nation founded not on conquest or inheritance, but on the consent of the governed. The debate that follows is intense and sometimes bitter. Delegates who have worked together for years find themselves on opposite sides of the most important question any of them will ever face. Some still believe reconciliation is possible, that independence is premature and dangerous. Others argue that the die has already been cast, that the war has made independence a fact that Congress merely needs to acknowledge. The future of a continent hangs on their decision, and they know it. While Congress debates Lee's resolution, they appoint a committee to draft a declaration explaining their decision to the world. The committee includes some of the most distinguished men in America: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. But it's Jefferson, the youngest member at 33, who takes up his pen in a rented room on Market Street in Philadelphia and begins to write words that will echo through history. Jefferson writes through the humid Philadelphia nights, his pen scratching across paper as he searches for words that can capture something unprecedented. How do you explain to the world that a people have chosen to break free from everything they've ever known? How do you justify revolution to those who still believe in the divine right of kings? The room is small and sweltering, and outside his window, the sounds of a bustling colonial city remind him that ordinary life continues even as he attempts to write the birth certificate of a new nation. The words that flow from Jefferson's pen aren't entirely his own. He draws from philosophers he's read, from conversations with Adams and Franklin, from ideas that have been percolating through colonial society for years. But somehow, in the act of writing, these borrowed thoughts transform into something new, something that captures the essence of what the colonists have discovered about themselves. They are, he writes, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, not granted by kings or governments, but inherent in their humanity. It's a radical idea, really, when you think about it in the context of 1776. Most of the world still believes that political authority flows downward from monarchs to subjects, that ordinary people exist to serve their betters. Jefferson turns this upside down. Governments, he argues, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The people come first. Authority flows upward, not down. It's a complete inversion of the political order that has governed human societies for millennia. The draft that Jefferson presents to the committee is elegant and philosophical, but Adams and Franklin know that philosophy alone won't be enough. The declaration must also be practical, a legal document that explains to the world exactly why the Americans believe they have the right to rebel. So they help Jefferson craft a long list of grievances against King George III, a bill of particulars that transforms abstract principles into concrete complaints. The king has imposed taxes without consent. He has cut off trade with all parts of the world. He has deprived the colonists of trial by jury in many cases. He has kept standing armies among them in times of peace. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for their salaries and tenure. The list goes on. 27 specific charges that paint a picture of systematic tyranny. Each complaint is familiar to anyone who has followed the escalating crisis between Britain and America, but together they create a powerful narrative of oppression and resistance. When the committee presents the declaration to Congress on June 28th, the delegates face a document unlike anything they've ever seen. It's part philosophy, part legal brief, part manifesto. It speaks in the language of natural rights and universal principles, but it's grounded in the specific experiences of specific people living through a specific historical moment. Most importantly, it does what no political document has ever done before. It assumes that ordinary people have the capacity for self-government. The debates over the declaration consume the first days of July. Delegates pore over every word, every phrase, every implication. Some worry that the language is too radical, that it will frighten away potential allies. Others argue that it doesn't go far enough, that it should condemn slavery as well as political oppression. Jefferson watches as Congress makes changes to his carefully crafted prose, striking out passages he's particularly proud of, adding phrases that seem to him clunky and unnecessary. It's painful, but it's also democracy in action, the messy process by which individual vision becomes collective will. The most contentious debate centers on slavery. Jefferson's original draft includes a passage condemning the king for forcing the slave trade on the colonies, but delegates from South Carolina and Georgia object strenuously. They know that their rice and indigo plantations depend on enslaved labor, and they're not willing to commit to ending the institution, even in principle. The passage is struck from the final document, a compromise that will haunt the new nation for generations to come. On July 2nd, Congress finally votes on Lee's resolution for independence. The tally is 12 colonies in favor, with New York abstaining because its delegates lack clear instructions from home. John Adams writes to his wife Abigail that July 2nd will be remembered as the most important date in American history, the day when the colonies finally and irrevocably chose freedom over security, uncertainty over familiarity, the unknown future over the predictable past. But it's July 4th that history will remember, the day Congress approves the final version of Jefferson's Declaration. The document that emerges from their deliberations is shorter than Jefferson's original draft, but no less powerful. It begins with words that have become sacred text to Americans. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. These are careful, lawyerly words, but they carry revolutionary implications. The Declaration doesn't just announce American independence, it attempts to explain the American experiment to a skeptical world. Never before has a people thrown off their government simply because they believed they could govern themselves better. Revolutions have been fought to replace bad kings with good ones, to restore ancient rights that have been trampled, to resist foreign conquest. But the American Revolution is something new, an attempt to create a government based entirely on the consent of the governed. The signing of the Declaration on July 4th is more ceremonial than dramatic. Most of the actual signatures won't be added until August, when a formal copy is prepared on parchment. But the psychological effect is immediate and profound. By putting their names to the document, the delegates are committing treason against the British Crown. They're literally betting their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honour on the belief that free people can govern themselves. Benjamin Franklin, ever the realist, captures the moment perfectly. As the delegates file out of the State House after approving the Declaration, someone remarks that they've given birth to a republic. Yes, Franklin replies, if you can keep it. He understands what many of his colleagues don't quite grasp yet. Declaring independence is the easy part. Building a nation that can survive and prosper, that can defend itself against enemies and govern itself wisely, that's the real challenge. Word of the Declaration spreads slowly at first, carried by riders and ships to every corner of the American colonies. In New York, Washington has the document read to his troops before they face a massive British invasion. In Boston, crowds gather in the streets to hear the words that transform them from rebels into patriots. In Charleston and Savannah, in farmhouses and frontier settlements, Americans learn that they are no longer British subjects. They are citizens of a new nation that exists, so far, only on paper and in their collective imagination. The British reaction, when it comes, is a mixture of outrage and disbelief. How dare these colonial upstarts presume to lecture the world about the rights of man? King George III dismisses the declaration as the work of ambitious demagogues who have misled the innocent colonists. Parliament refuses even to consider American peace overtures. The only acceptable outcome is complete submission to British authority. There will be no negotiation, no compromise, no middle ground between independence and subjugation. This hardening of positions on both sides transforms what might have remained a civil conflict into something approaching total war. The British begin hiring German mercenaries, expanding their naval blockade, and seeking Indian allies on the frontier. They're no longer trying to restore rebellious subjects to obedience. They're trying to crush a rival nation before it can establish itself. The Americans respond by seeking foreign allies of their own, particularly the French, who have their own reasons for wanting to see British power diminished. Through the late summer and fall of 1776, the military situation deteriorates rapidly for the Americans. A massive British force lands on Staten Island and begins a systematic campaign to retake New York. Washington's Continental Army, poorly equipped and largely untrained, suffers a series of devastating defeats. By November, the remnants of the American force are retreating across New Jersey with British pursuers close behind. The revolution that began with such high hopes seems on the verge of collapse. It's during this dark period that Thomas Paine publishes the first of his crisis papers, beginning with words that capture the desperate mood of the moment. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot, he writes, will shrink from the service of their country in this crisis. But those who stand firm now deserve the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Paine's words provide a psychological lifeline for Americans who are beginning to wonder if they've made a terrible mistake. The Declaration promised them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But all they see is war, death, and destruction. British forces occupy New York and Newport. Congress has fled Philadelphia. The Continental Army is melting away as soldiers desert or simply go home when their enlistments expire. The cause of independence, which seemed so noble in July, looks increasingly hopeless as winter approaches. But Washington refuses to give up. On Christmas night, 1776, he leads his ragged army across the ice-choked Delaware River for a surprise attack on Trenton. The victory is small in military terms, just a few hundred Hessian prisoners and some much-needed supplies. But psychologically, it's enormous. It proves that the Continental Army can still fight, can still win, can still surprise enemies who have grown overconfident. More importantly, it demonstrates that Washington himself has the kind of stubborn determination that revolutions require to succeed. The Trenton victory revives American morale and brings new recruits to the Continental Army. But it doesn't change the fundamental military situation. The British still control the major ports, still have naval superiority, still possess significant advantages in training, equipment, and logistics. What the Americans have is something harder to quantify, but perhaps more important in the long run. They have a cause that's worth the sacrifice, a vision of the future that sustains them through present hardships. That vision is articulated not just in grand declarations and stirring pamphlets, but in countless small acts of commitment. A farmer who sends his grain to the Continental Army instead of selling it to British buyers. A woman who melts down her pewter dishes to make musket balls. A minister who preaches that resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. A shopkeeper who accepts nearly worthless continental currency because he believes in American independence. These individual choices, multiplied across thousands of communities, create the social foundation that makes military resistance possible. The war drags on through 1777 and 1778, with victories and defeats on both sides, but no decisive resolution. The British win major battles but can't seem to win the war. Every time they occupy a city or defeat an American army, new resistance springs up elsewhere. The Americans lose more battles than they win, but they keep fighting, keep retreating, keep regrouping for the next engagement. It's a war of endurance as much as courage. And gradually, the British begin to realize that they may have bitten off more than they can chew. The turning point comes not on American battlefields, but in European diplomatic councils. The French have been watching the American rebellion with interest, providing covert aid and hoping to see their British rivals weakened. But they're reluctant to openly support what might turn out to be a losing cause. The American victory at Saratoga in October 1777, where an entire British army surrenders to Continental forces, finally convinces the French that the Americans might actually win their independence. The French alliance, signed in February 1778, transforms the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global war. Now, Britain must defend not just its North American territories, but its possessions in the Caribbean, India, and the Mediterranean. French ships challenge British naval supremacy, French gold finances, American military operations, and French soldiers fight alongside Continental troops. What began as a dispute over taxation has become a worldwide conflict that will reshape the balance of power for generations. Yet even with French support, American independence remains far from certain. The British adapt their strategy, focusing on the southern colonies where they believe loyalist sentiment is stronger. They win significant victories in Georgia and South Carolina, and for a time it seems possible that they might split the rebellion in two. The Continental Army suffers through the brutal winter at Valley Forge, where soldiers leave bloody footprints in the snow and hundreds die from cold and disease. It's during these dark months that the character of the American cause is truly tested. Anyone can support independence when victory seems certain and the costs are low. But what about when the cause demands everything and offers no guarantee of success? At Valley Forge, Washington's army discovers something about itself that surprises even its commander. They find that they're willing to endure almost anything for the chance to be free, to govern themselves, to build something new in the world. The soldiers who emerge from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 are different from the enthusiastic volunteers who first answered the call to arms. They're harder, more experienced, more realistic about the costs of war, but they're also more committed to the cause they're fighting for. They've learned that independence isn't something that can be granted or taken away by others. It's something that must be claimed and defended by those who want it. As the war enters its final phase, both sides are exhausted by years of conflict. The British public is growing weary of a costly war that seems to have no end. The Americans are struggling to maintain their armies and fund their government. But there's a crucial difference in their situations. The British are fighting to maintain an empire that they're not sure is worth the cost. The Americans are fighting for a future that they're determined to create. That determination carries them through the final campaigns of the war, through the siege of Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrenders his army, through the long negotiations that finally produce a peace treaty recognizing American independence. When the last British ships sail out of New York Harbor in November 1783, they leave behind not just 13 former colonies, but a new kind of nation, one founded on the revolutionary idea that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. The America that emerges from the Revolutionary War is not the America that exists today. It's a loose confederation of states, bound together by shared experience, but divided by competing interests and conflicting visions of the future. The Articles of Confederation that govern this new nation are weak and inadequate, unable to solve the pressing problems of debt, trade, and defense that face the young republic. But something unprecedented has been accomplished. For the first time in human history, a people have successfully thrown off their government and created a new one based entirely on their own consent. They've proved that ordinary human beings, without noble birth or divine appointment, can govern themselves wisely and well. It's an experiment that will inspire democratic movements around the world and challenge the foundations of monarchical government everywhere. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 couldn't have imagined what their actions would ultimately lead to. They thought they were solving a specific problem, freeing themselves from what they saw as British tyranny. But they were actually unleashing forces that would transform not just America, but the entire world. The idea that all men are created equal, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that fail to protect their rights. These concepts would spread far beyond American shores. The success of the American experiment didn't end with independence. If anything, it revealed just how difficult the task ahead would be. You see, declaring yourself free is one thing. Actually, building a nation that can survive and prosper, that's something else entirely. And by 1783, as the last British soldiers sailed away from New York Harbor, Americans were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had undertaken. Picture the scene in those early years after the war. The Continental Army had disbanded, sending farmers and craftsmen back to their homes with little more than promises of payment for their service. The new nation was drowning in debt, owing millions to foreign creditors and its own soldiers. Trade had been disrupted, currencies were nearly worthless, and there was no real mechanism for the 13 states to work together on anything important. It was as if they had torn down an old house, but hadn't quite figured out how to build a new one in its place. The Articles of Confederation, hastily written during the war, created what could charitably be called a government. But it was a government with no power to tax, no power to regulate trade between states, and no power to enforce its own laws. Each state jealously guarded its sovereignty, treating the others almost like foreign countries. Massachusetts could tax goods from Virginia. New York could block navigation on rivers that other states needed for trade. It was independence, certainly, but it was also chaos. And yet, in this seeming disorder, something remarkable was happening. Americans were learning to govern themselves not just in grand assemblies and formal declarations, but in the mundane daily work of democracy. Town meetings in New England, county courts in the South, state legislatures everywhere were wrestling with questions that had never been asked before. How do you balance individual liberty with collective responsibility? How do you create laws that reflect the will of the people while protecting the rights of minorities? How do you maintain order without tyranny? These weren't abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were practical problems that required practical solutions. A farmer in western Massachusetts, struggling with debt and facing foreclosure, didn't care about the elegant theories of government that had inspired the Declaration of Independence. He cared about whether the new system would treat him fairly, whether his voice would be heard, whether his children would have opportunities he never had. The tensions came to a head in 1786 with what became known as Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, led a group of debt-ridden farmers in western Massachusetts in an uprising against the state government. They closed courts to prevent foreclosures, threatened tax collectors, and even marched on the federal arsenal in Springfield. It wasn't a large rebellion, and it was quickly put down, but it sent shockwaves through the young nation. Here was the nightmare that had haunted the founders from the beginning. What if the people, in whose name they had fought the revolution, turned out to be ungovernable? What if democracy led not to freedom, but to anarchy? Some began to whisper that perhaps they had made a mistake, that ordinary people weren't capable of self-government after all. Maybe they needed a king, or at least a much stronger government than the Articles of Confederation provided. But others saw Shays' rebellion differently. Yes, it was dangerous and disruptive, but it was also proof that the system was working in its own messy way. The rebels weren't trying to overthrow democracy. They were trying to use it to make their voices heard in a system they believed had stopped listening to them. The real problem wasn't too much democracy, but too little government, too few mechanisms for addressing legitimate grievances through peaceful means. This realization led to one of the most extraordinary gatherings in human history. In the summer of 1787, 55 men assembled in Philadelphia for what was supposed to be a simple revision of the Articles of Confederation. Instead, meeting in the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier, they decided to start over completely. They would create not just a new government, but a new form of government, one that had never been tried before on such a scale. The Constitutional Convention, as it came to be known, was democracy in its purest form. Here were men from different states, different backgrounds, different interests, trying to find common ground on the most fundamental questions of political organization. How do you create a government strong enough to function but not so strong that it becomes tyrannical? How do you balance the interests of large states and small states, of farming regions and commercial centers, of those who own slaves and those who oppose slavery? The debates were intense, sometimes bitter. The Virginia Plan proposed a strong national government with representation based on population. The New Jersey Plan countered with equal representation for all states regardless of size. The Connecticut Compromise split the difference, creating a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in one house and equal representation in the other. It was messy, complicated, and far from perfect, but it worked. Perhaps most remarkably, these men understood that they weren't creating something permanent and unchangeable. They built into their new constitution a mechanism for amendment, a recognition that future generations might need to adapt the system to meet challenges they couldn't even imagine. It was an act of extraordinary humility, really, an admission that even the wisest men of their generation couldn't foresee every problem or provide every solution. The constitution they produced was a masterpiece of political engineering, but it was also a leap of faith. It assumed that people could be trusted with power if that power was properly divided and checked. It created a presidency strong enough to provide leadership but limited by Congress and the courts. It established a federal system that preserved state authority while creating a national government capable of addressing national problems. Most audaciously, it began with 3 simple words that changed everything. We the people. Hi, not we the states, or we the representatives, or we the delegates, but we the people. In those 3 words lay the entire revolutionary premise of American government. Power comes from the bottom up, not the top down. The government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. It was a radical idea in 1787, and in many ways it remains radical today. But creating a constitution and making it work are 2 very different things. The document that emerged from Philadelphia in September 1787 was just words on paper until it could be ratified by the states and implemented by real people facing real problems. And there were plenty of Americans who looked at this new constitution and saw not liberation, but a new form of tyranny. The Anti-Federalists, as they came to be called, raised searching questions about the proposed system. Where was the Bill of Rights that would protect individual liberties? How could the states maintain their independence under such a strong national government? What would prevent this new president from becoming a king in all but name? These weren't frivolous concerns raised by troublemakers. They were serious questions asked by serious people who had fought a revolution to escape from exactly the kind of concentrated power they saw in the new constitution. The debate over ratification consumed the nation for nearly a year. In newspapers and pamphlets, in state conventions and town meetings, Americans argued about the most fundamental questions of political organization. It was a remarkable moment, really, when an entire people stopped to consider how they wanted to be governed. Not because they were facing a crisis or external threat, but simply because they believed they could do better. The Federalists, led by brilliant advocates like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, made their case in a series of newspaper essays that became known as the Federalist Papers. These weren't just political arguments, they were profound meditations on the nature of democracy, the dangers of faction, and the possibility of republican government on a continental scale. They remain to this day some of the most insightful writing ever produced about the challenges and promises of democratic government. Gradually, state by state, the Constitution was ratified. Delaware was first, followed by Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and others. Some states ratified easily, convinced that the new system would solve their problems. Others held out, demanding amendments to protect individual rights. New York's ratification convention was so close that Hamilton and his allies had to use every parliamentary trick they could think of to secure victory. Virginia's convention included some of the most brilliant orators of the age, arguing on both sides. When New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify in June 1788, the Constitution officially became the supreme law of the land. But it wasn't until Virginia and New York also joined that the new system had any real chance of success. Without those large, influential states, the United States would have been little more than a rump confederation of small states along the coast. The man chosen to serve as the first president under this new constitution faced challenges that would have daunted anyone. George Washington had led the Continental Army to victory, had presided over the Constitutional Convention, and commanded the respect of virtually every American. But how do you create a presidency that's strong enough to lead, but not so strong that it threatens liberty? How do you establish precedents that will guide future generations without binding them too tightly to the decisions of the past? Washington understood that everything he did would set a precedent. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, the way he conducted meetings, all of it would help define what it meant to be President of the United States. He chose a middle path, dignified but not regal, accessible but not common. He established the principle that the president was the servant of the people, not their master, but also that the office deserved respect and carried real authority. Perhaps most importantly, Washington established the precedent of peaceful transfer of power. When his second term ended in 1797, he simply stepped down and returned to his farm at Mount Vernon. For most of human history, people who held ultimate power gave it up only when forced to do so, by death or defeat. Washington gave it up voluntarily because that's what the Constitution required and what Republican government demanded. It was, in its quiet way, as revolutionary as anything he had done as a general. The America that Washington left to his successors was still fragile, still experimental, still uncertain of its ultimate destiny. The new nation faced enormous challenges: hostile Indian tribes on the frontier, European powers that didn't take American independence seriously, political parties that threatened to tear the Union apart, and the growing contradiction between the promise of equality and the reality of slavery. But the foundation had been laid, the precedents established, the experiment in self-government begun. What's remarkable, when you look back on those early years, is how much of what we take for granted today was improvised, debated, and slowly worked out through trial and error. The idea of a loyal opposition, political parties that could disagree fundamentally about policy while still accepting the legitimacy of the system. The concept of judicial review, the power of courts to declare laws unconstitutional. The notion of a free press that could criticize the government without being shut down or prosecuted. None of these were clearly established by the Constitution. They emerged through practice, through conflict, through the messy process of democracy working itself out. By the time Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated as the third president in 1801, the American experiment was beginning to look like it might actually succeed. The peaceful transfer of power from Federalists to Democratic Republicans, from Washington's political heirs to his political opponents, proved that the system could survive partisan conflict. Jefferson's inaugural address spoke of healing divisions and moving forward together. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. But Jefferson also understood that the American Revolution was far from complete. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the country and opened vast new territories for settlement. The Lewis and Clark expedition sent American explorers across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. The War of 1812 tested American independence once more against British power and proved that the United States could defend itself. Each of these events expanded the meaning of American independence, pushing the boundaries of what the founders had imagined possible. The young nation was growing, changing, becoming something that none of its founders had fully envisioned. Factories were sprouting in New England, powered by water wheels and filled with workers who had left their farms for wages and city life. Canals and roads were connecting distant regions, creating a national market for goods and ideas. Immigrants were arriving from Ireland and Germany and other parts of Europe, adding their own traditions to the American mix. And always, threading through everything like a fault line through bedrock, was the question of slavery. The founders had known it was a problem, had recognized the contradiction between proclaiming that all men are created equal while keeping millions in bondage. Some, like Jefferson, had hoped that slavery would gradually disappear as the nation grew more prosperous and enlightened. Others, like Hamilton, had worked actively for abolition. But the economic interests built around slave labor proved stronger than moral qualms or political principles. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to manage the slavery question by balancing slave and free states. But it was really just postponing the reckoning. Jefferson, hearing about the compromise in his retirement, wrote that it filled him with terror. The question of slavery in the territories, he said, was like a fire bell in the night, awakening him to the realization that the Union might not survive the contradictions built into its foundation. Yet, for all its problems and contradictions, the American experiment continued to inspire people around the world. The revolutions that swept through Europe in 1848 looked to America as proof that Republican government was possible. The abolitionists who fought slavery drew on the Declaration of Independence's promise that all men are created equal. The women who began demanding political rights in the 1840s and 1850s pointed to the same democratic principles that had justified American independence. The America of the 1850s was vastly different from the collection of colonies that had declared independence in 1776. It stretched from ocean to ocean, encompassed millions of square miles, and included dozens of states. Its population had grown from 2.5 million to more than 23 million. Its economy had been transformed by industry, transportation, and technology. Its culture had been enriched by immigrants from around the world. But in its essence, it remained what the founders had intended, an experiment in self-government, a test of whether people could be trusted to rule themselves wisely and well. That experiment had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in some ways. Americans enjoyed freedoms that were still rare in most of the world. They had created wealth and opportunity on a scale never before seen. They had proved that Republican government could work on a continental scale. Yet the experiment remained incomplete, its ultimate success still uncertain. The question of slavery continued to poison American politics and threaten American unity. The rights promised in the Declaration of Independence were still denied to women, to Native Americans, to free blacks in much of the country. The democracy that had been born in 1776 was still growing, still changing, still working out the implications of its founding principles. As you drift off tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself back in those early years of the Republic, when everything was new and uncertain and full of possibility, when ordinary people were discovering that they could govern themselves, that they could create something better than what they had inherited, that they could build a nation based on the revolutionary idea that all people are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. The story of American independence didn't end with the signing of the Declaration or the victory at Yorktown or even the ratification of the Constitution. It continued through every generation that chose to preserve and extend the promise of democracy, through every person who claimed their rights as a citizen, through every moment when Americans decided that the experiment in self-government was worth continuing. And in a way, that story continues today, in every election, in every peaceful transfer of power, in every moment when people choose to participate in the ongoing work of democracy. The revolution that began in 1776 wasn't just about breaking free from British rule. It was about creating something new in the world, something that would continue to evolve and grow and inspire long after its founders had passed into history. The gentle rhythm of that ongoing story, the quiet persistence of democratic ideals working themselves out through time. That's what carries us forward into sleep and dreams of what might still be possible in a world where people dare to believe they can govern themselves. Sleep comes easily when you're carried along by the gentle current of history, doesn't it? And as we drift deeper into the story of how America became itself, we find ourselves in those quiet decades after the Constitution was signed, when the grand declarations had been made and the real work of nation building began. It's in these years, the 1790s and early 1800s, that we see something remarkable happening. Not the dramatic moments that fill textbooks, but the slower, deeper process of a people learning what it actually means to be free. Picture a small town in Pennsylvania in 1798. The revolutionary fervor has cooled, but something else has taken its place. A kind of practical democracy that shows up not in grand speeches but in everyday choices. The local newspaper prints opinions that would have been treasonous 20 years earlier. The town meeting argues about roads and taxes with a familiarity that would have seemed impossible when such decisions were made by distant governors. There's a courthouse where ordinary farmers serve on juries, weighing evidence and making judgments that affect their neighbors' lives. It's democracy not as an idea, but as a way of living. But this new way of living isn't without its growing pains. By the late 1790s, the unity that had carried Americans through the revolution is fracturing along lines that no one quite expected. It starts with questions about money and trade, about whether America should align itself with Britain or France, about how much power the federal government should have. But it grows into something deeper, a fundamental disagreement about what kind of nation America should become. On one side stand the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. They envision an America that can compete with European powers, with strong banks and growing cities and thriving commerce. They believe that government should be in the hands of educated, propertied men who understand the complexities of finance and diplomacy. They're not against democracy exactly, but they worry that too much democracy might lead to chaos, that ordinary people might make decisions that hurt everyone in the long run. On the other side are the Democratic Republicans, followers of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They dream of an America of small farmers and artisans, where government stays close to the people and power doesn't concentrate in the hands of a few. They believe that ordinary Americans, given the chance, will govern themselves wisely. They're suspicious of banks and cities, and anything that smells like the aristocracy they fought a revolution to escape. The debate between these two visions plays out in newspapers and pamphlets, in Congress and coffee houses, with a passion that sometimes threatens to tear the young nation apart. When Hamilton proposes a national bank, Jefferson sees it as a betrayal of everything the revolution stood for. When Jefferson negotiates the Louisiana Purchase, the Federalists worry that he's overstepping presidential authority. Each side believes the other is leading America toward disaster. The tension peaks during John Adams' presidency, when fear of war with France leads to the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws make it illegal to criticize the government in ways that might be deemed seditious, and they give the president power to deport foreigners he considers dangerous. To Jefferson and his supporters, This looks exactly like the kind of tyranny they fought the revolution to prevent. How can a free people remain free if they can't speak freely about their government? The crisis deepens when Jefferson and Madison, working in secret, draft the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing that states have the right to nullify federal laws they consider unconstitutional. It's a dangerous precedent, one that will haunt the nation for decades to come. But in the moment, it feels like the only way to preserve the principles of 1776 against what they see as a creeping authoritarianism. And then something extraordinary happens. In the election of 1800, the American people choose Jefferson over Adams, Democratic Republicans over Federalists, the vision of an agricultural republic over that of a commercial empire. More importantly, Adams accepts the result. He packs his bags, leaves the capital, and returns to his farm in Massachusetts. No armies march, no coups are attempted. Power passes peacefully from one party to another, from one vision of America to another. It's a moment that proves something remarkable about the American experiment. The system works not because it's perfect, but because it's flexible enough to accommodate fundamental disagreements without breaking apart. Jefferson, in his inaugural address, tries to heal the wounds of the campaign. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," he says, suggesting that beneath the partisan divisions, Americans share something deeper, a commitment to the idea that people can govern themselves. But Jefferson's presidency also reveals the complexities and contradictions that will challenge American democracy for generations to come. The Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the country, opening vast new territories for settlement and development. It's a stunning achievement, transforming America from a coastal republic into a continental empire. But it also raises uncomfortable questions about the Constitution, about presidential power, about what happens to the Native American tribes who already live on those lands. Jefferson himself is conflicted about the purchase. He believes in strict interpretation of the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't explicitly give the president power to acquire new territory. He believes in limited government, but this is an enormous expansion of federal power. He believes in the rights of man, but the purchase will lead to the displacement and destruction of countless Native American communities. Yet he also believes in the destiny of America, in its mission to spread freedom and democracy across the continent. The Lewis and Clark expedition that follows the Louisiana Purchase captures something essential about the American spirit in these early years. Here are two men leading a small band of explorers across thousands of miles of unmapped territory, not to conquer or exploit, but to learn and understand. They map rivers and catalogue plants and animals. They meet with Native American tribes, sometimes as friends, sometimes as cautious strangers. They write detailed journals that reveal not just the geography of the West, but the mindset of a nation still discovering what it might become. When they return from the Pacific Ocean in 1806, Lewis and Clark bring back more than maps and specimens. They bring back a vision of American possibility that will shape the nation's understanding of itself for generations. America isn't just the 13 colonies that declared independence in 1776. It's a continental nation with resources and opportunities beyond anything the founders imagined. The question is, what to do with all that space, all that potential? The answer comes gradually, through the choices of thousands of ordinary Americans who load their possessions into wagons and head west. They're farmers looking for better land, merchants seeking new markets, families hoping for fresh starts. They don't think of themselves as agents of empire or manifest destiny. They're just people trying to build better lives for themselves and their children. But collectively, their individual choices reshape the continent and challenge every assumption about what America is supposed to be. This westward movement brings Americans into contact with peoples and places that complicate every simple notion about freedom and democracy. The Native American tribes of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains have their own ideas about how to live, their own relationships with the land, their own forms of governance that have worked for centuries. The encounter between expanding America and indigenous America will be one of the most tragic and complex chapters in the nation's history. There are also the questions raised by the expansion of slavery into new territories. Jefferson had hoped that slavery would gradually disappear as the nation grew more prosperous and enlightened. But the invention of the cotton gin makes slave labor more profitable than ever, and the acquisition of new lands creates new opportunities for the expansion of slavery. The Missouri Crisis of 1819-1820 forces Americans to confront the reality that their growth as a nation might actually strengthen, rather than weaken, the institution they claimed to oppose. The Missouri Compromise, which admits Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery in the northern portion of the Louisiana Territory, manages the immediate crisis, but solves nothing fundamental. It's a line drawn across a map, an attempt to contain the contradiction between American ideals and American realities. But as Jefferson recognizes, it's also a warning. The slavery question won't go away just because politicians have found a temporary solution. Through all of these challenges and changes, something remarkable is happening to the American people themselves. They're becoming something new, something that hasn't existed before in human history. Not quite European anymore, but not yet fully American either. They're developing their own accent, their own customs, their own way of looking at the world. They're more informal than Europeans, more optimistic, more willing to believe that things can be different and better. This emerging American character shows up in unexpected places, in the religious revivals that sweep through frontier communities, where ordinary people claim direct relationships with God without the mediation of established churches. In the voluntary associations that spring up everywhere, groups of citizens organizing themselves to build schools and hospitals and roads without waiting for government to act. In the newspapers and magazines that multiply across the country, creating the first truly national conversation in American history. It appears in the way Americans talk about work and success. In Europe, your station in life is largely determined by the circumstances of your birth. In America, or so Americans tell themselves, you can rise as high as your talents and efforts will take you. It's not entirely true, of course. Wealth and family connections still matter, and they matter even more if you're white and male and Protestant. But the idea that merit should determine status, that anyone can make something of themselves, becomes central to American identity. This faith in individual possibility shapes everything from American politics to American literature. Politicians appeal to voters not as subjects who owe deference to their betters, but as citizens capable of making their own judgments. Writers like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper create distinctly American stories, tales that celebrate American landscapes and American characters. Even American humor develops its own flavor, more irreverent and democratic than European wit, more willing to puncture pretension and mock authority. But perhaps most importantly, Americans are learning to live with disagreement in ways that earlier societies never managed. The partisan battles of the 1790s and early 1800s are fierce and sometimes bitter, but they don't lead to civil war or revolution. Instead, they lead to elections, to peaceful transfers of power, to the gradual working out of differences through democratic processes. It's messy and sometimes ugly, but it works. The War of 1812 tests this new American identity in unexpected ways. On the surface, it's a conflict about trade and maritime rights, about British interference with American shipping and British impressment of American sailors. But underneath, it's about something deeper. Can this young republic command respect from the established powers of Europe? Can Americans defend what they've built? Or will they remain forever dependent on the goodwill of others? The war itself is a confused and confusing affair, with victories and defeats on both sides and no clear resolution. British forces burn Washington, D.C., sending President Madison fleeing into the countryside. American forces win surprising victories on the Great Lakes and at New Orleans. The Treaty of Ghent that ends the war essentially restores the status quo that existed before the fighting began. But the psychological impact of the war is enormous. Americans prove to themselves and to the world that they can defend their independence, that the experiment in self-government is here to stay. The victory at New Orleans makes Andrew Jackson a national hero and introduces Americans to a new kind of political figure, the democratic frontiersman, who appeals directly to ordinary voters. The successful defense of Baltimore Harbor inspires Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner, giving Americans a national anthem that celebrates resilience in the face of adversity. More subtly, the War of 1812 accelerates the process by which Americans stop thinking of themselves as transplanted Europeans and start thinking of themselves as something new. The Hartford Convention, where New England Federalists meet to discuss their opposition to the war, marks the end of serious pro-British sentiment in American politics. After 1815, Americans may disagree about many things, but they don't disagree about being Americans. The years following the War of 1812 bring what historians call the era of good feelings, a time of relative political harmony and economic growth. James Monroe wins the presidency with virtually no opposition, and partisan divisions seem to fade as the country focuses on expansion and development. The Missouri Compromise manages the slavery question, at least temporarily. The Monroe Doctrine warns European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, while promising that America won't interfere in European affairs. But beneath the surface calm, the forces that will reshape American society are already at work. The first factories are appearing in New England, powered by water wheels and filled with workers who have left their farms for wage labor. Canals and turnpikes are connecting distant regions, creating national markets for goods and ideas. The cotton gin is making slave labor more profitable and spreading plantation agriculture across the Deep South. Immigration is beginning to accelerate as economic hardship in Europe sends thousands of families looking for opportunities in America. Most importantly, a new generation is coming of age. Americans who have no memory of British rule, no personal connection to the founders, no direct experience of the struggles that created the nation. For them, American independence isn't a hard-won achievement that must be carefully preserved. It's simply the natural state of things, the baseline from which all other possibilities emerge. They take for granted freedoms that their parents fought and died to secure, and they're ready to push those freedoms even further. This generational shift shows up in the presidential election of 1824, when none of the candidates wins a majority in the Electoral College, and the House of Representatives must choose between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Adams, the son of a founder, represents the old Republican virtues of education, public service, and deference to established institutions. Jackson represents something new and potentially dangerous, a democratic populism that appeals directly to ordinary voters and promises to break the power of established elites. When Adams wins the presidency through what Jackson supporters call a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay, the stage is set for a political revolution. The election of 1828 becomes a referendum not just on policies, but on the nature of American democracy itself. Should power remain in the hands of educated, experienced leaders who understand the complexities of governance? Or should it pass to the common people, whose instincts and interests matter more than their formal qualifications? Jackson's overwhelming victory in 1828 answers that question decisively. The age of Jackson has begun, and with it, a new chapter in the American experiment, one that will test whether a democracy can survive when it truly becomes democratic, when it extends political power to ordinary people who have no special training in the art of governance. As we drift toward the edge of sleep, following the gentle current of this unfolding story, we can sense the enormous changes that lie ahead. The America of the 1820s is still recognizably connected to the America of 1776, but it's also becoming something the founders never quite imagined: larger, more diverse, more democratic, more divided, more dynamic. The simple republic of farmers and merchants is evolving into something unprecedented in human history. A continental democracy that will soon stretch from ocean to ocean. The revolution that began with a declaration of independence is still unfolding, still working out the implications of its founding principles, still discovering what it means for people to govern themselves. And in that ongoing discovery, in that endless working out of democratic possibilities, lies both the promise and the peril of the American experiment. The story continues, carrying us forward into dreams of what might still be possible when ordinary people dare to believe they can shape their own destiny. The changes that swept through America in the 1830s and 1840s weren't the kind that announced themselves with fanfare or grand declarations. They crept in quietly, like morning light gradually filling a room, until suddenly people looked around and realized they were living in a different world than the one their parents had known. The gentle rhythm of rural life, the predictable cycles of planting and harvest that had governed American existence since colonial times, began to give way to something faster, louder, more urgent. Picture a young woman in Lowell, Massachusetts, in 1835, standing before a power loom in one of the new textile mills that line the Merrimack River. 6 months ago, she was living on her family's farm in New Hampshire, helping with the endless round of chores that farm life demanded. Now she works 12 hours a day, tending machines that never tire, never rest, never slow their relentless pace. The work is hard and the hours long, but for the first time in her life, she has money of her own, wages that buy her books and ribbons, and a kind of independence her mother never knew. She's part of something that's happening across New England and spreading westward, the slow transformation of America from a nation of farmers into something more complex and varied. The mills and factories that spring up along rivers and streams don't just change where people work. They change how they think about work itself, about time and money, and the relationship between effort and reward. In the old world of farming, your labor followed natural rhythms, the demands of weather and season. In the new world of industry, your labor follows the rhythm of machines, the steady beat of progress that never stops for rain or sunshine. The changes ripple outward in ways that no one quite expects. The canals and roads that connect these new industrial centers to farms and markets don't just carry goods. They carry ideas, news, possibilities. A farmer in Ohio reads newspapers printed in New York. A merchant in Alabama learns about new farming techniques developed in Pennsylvania. Information flows along the same channels as cotton and wheat, creating the first truly national conversation in American history. This new connectivity breeds both opportunity and anxiety. In the growing cities, fortunes are made and lost with bewildering speed. Men who started with nothing become millionaires through clever investments or lucky timing. Others who seem secure find themselves ruined by market crashes or failed speculations. The old certainties of birth and breeding matter less than they used to. What matters now is adaptability, the ability to spot opportunities and seize them before they disappear. But the changes aren't just economic. They're social, cultural, spiritual in ways that touch every aspect of American life. The Second Great Awakening sweeps through communities like wildfire, bringing with it a new kind of religious enthusiasm that emphasizes personal salvation over formal doctrine. In camp meetings and revival services, ordinary people claim direct relationships with God, bypassing the established churches and their educated ministers. It's religious democracy in action, the same impulse that transformed politics now reshaping faith. The revival spirit spills over into reform movements that promise to perfect not just individual souls, but society itself. Groups organize to fight slavery, to promote temperance, to improve conditions in prisons and asylums. Women who have never been allowed to speak in public find their voices in these causes. discovering that they have opinions and abilities that the world needs to hear. The cult of domesticity that confines middle-class women to their homes creates its own contradictions, as women use their supposed moral superiority as justification for entering public life. Education becomes a crusade, led by reformers like Horace Mann, who believe that free public schools can solve almost any social problem. If democracy depends on an informed citizenry, then democracy demands that every child, regardless of family wealth, have access to learning. The common school movement spreads across the North and West, creating institutions that will reshape American society in ways their founders never imagined. In one-room schoolhouses and growing academies, children from different backgrounds sit side by side, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but the habits of citizenship. The transportation revolution that begins with canals and turnpikes accelerates with the coming of the railroad. The first steam locomotives seem like mechanical curiosities, noisy contraptions that frighten horses and spew smoke and sparks. But by the 1840s, railroad tracks are spreading across the landscape like iron spiderwebs, connecting distant places in ways that shrink both space and time. A journey that once took weeks now takes days. News that once travelled at the speed of horses now races along telegraph wires at the speed of lightning. These changes create new possibilities, but also new tensions. The market revolution, as historians would later call it, doesn't affect all Americans equally. The growing prosperity of northern cities depends partly on the cotton produced by enslaved workers on southern plantations. The expansion of democracy for white men coincides with the systematic exclusion of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The celebration of individual opportunity exists alongside the reality that women, African Americans, and immigrants face barriers that limit their choices. The presidency of Andrew Jackson embodies all of these contradictions. Jackson presents himself as the champion of the common man, the enemy of privilege and special interests. He dismantles the national bank, which he sees as a corrupt institution that benefits the wealthy at the expense of ordinary Americans. He opens government jobs to ordinary citizens rather than reserving them for the educated elite. He promises to restore the republic to its founding principles of equality and simplicity. But Jackson's democracy has sharp limits. His vision of equality extends only to white men, and even then, only to those who share his values and support his policies. He uses federal troops to force Native Americans from their homelands, implementing a policy of removal that destroys communities and cultures that have existed for generations. When South Carolina attempts to nullify federal tariff laws, Jackson threatens to use military force to preserve the Union, revealing an authoritarian streak that troubles even his supporters. The Trail of Tears that follows Jackson's Indian Removal Act represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. Thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and other tribal members are forced from their homes and marched hundreds of miles to unfamiliar territories west of the Mississippi. Many die along the way from disease, exposure, and exhaustion. It's a systematic destruction of peoples and cultures, justified by the democratic will of white voters who want their land. Yet even this tragedy reveals something about the American character that's both disturbing and significant. The removal isn't carried out in secret or justified by claims of racial superiority, though such claims certainly exist. Instead, it's debated in Congress and newspapers, defended as necessary for progress and civilization. The Cherokee fight it in federal courts and win a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court, though Jackson ignores the decision. Democracy and injustice coexist in ways that force Americans to confront the contradictions in their founding ideals. The question of slavery becomes more pressing as the nation expands westward. The Missouri Compromise had provided a temporary solution, but the acquisition of Texas and the prospect of war with Mexico reopen all the old wounds. Can slavery expand into new territories? Should it be allowed to do so? The questions aren't just legal or constitutional, they're moral, touching the deepest assumptions about human nature and American destiny. The abolition movement that emerges in the 1830s is unlike anything America has seen before. Led by figures like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, it doesn't just oppose slavery on practical grounds. It condemns it as a sin against God and humanity, demanding immediate emancipation rather than gradual reform. Garrison burns copies of the Constitution, calling it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Douglass, born into slavery but self-educated and brilliant, speaks with a moral authority that no white reformer can match. The response to abolitionism reveals the depth of American divisions. In the South, criticism of slavery becomes pass laws, restricting free virtually impossible as state speech and mail delivery. In the North, abolitionist speakers are attacked by mobs, their printing presses destroyed, their meetings disrupted. Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist editor in Illinois, is murdered by a pro-slavery mob. Free speech as much as emancipation, but becoming a martyr to the cause of the movement grows despite the violence, spreading through churches and reform societies, women's groups and political organizations. The Underground Railroad develops as a network of safe houses and secret routes that help enslaved people escape to freedom in the North or Canada. Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave, makes repeated journeys into the South to lead others to freedom, earning the nickname Moses for her courage and success. The women who participate in these reform movements discover something unexpected about themselves and their society. In fighting for the rights of others, they begin to question their own exclusion from political life. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, marks the beginning of the organized women's rights movement in America. The Declaration of Sentiments they produce deliberately echoes the Declaration of Independence, asserting that all men and women are created equal. The idea seems radical, even ridiculous to most Americans in 1848. Women's roles are defined by nature and scripture, by biological differences that seem to make political equality impossible. But the women at Seneca Falls argue that these differences have been exaggerated and used to justify artificial restrictions on women's opportunities. If women can run businesses and manage households, if they can teach children and organize reform movements, why can't they vote and hold office? The question remains largely theoretical in the 1840s, but it plants seeds that will grow in future generations. More immediately, the reform movements of this period create new models of political participation that expand democracy even when formal political rights remain restricted. Through petitions and publications, rallies and conventions, Americans who can't vote still find ways to influence public policy and shape national debates. The Mexican-American War that begins in 1846 tests all of these democratic innovations in unexpected ways. The war itself is controversial, opposed by many Northerners who see it as a Southern plot to expand slavery. Henry David Thoreau goes to jail rather than pay taxes to support what he considers an unjust war. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln challenges the war's justifications and earns a reputation as an opponent of executive power. But the war also reveals the growing confidence and capability of American democratic institutions. Congress debates the conflict openly. Newspapers report on military campaigns with unprecedented detail, and public opinion influences strategic decisions in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. When the war ends with American victory and the acquisition of vast new territories in the Southwest, the nation faces once again the fundamental question of what to do with its success. The Compromise of 1850 attempts to resolve the territorial question through a complex series of trades and concessions. California enters the Union as a free state, while the other territories acquired from Mexico are organized without restrictions on slavery. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C., but slavery itself remains legal there. Most controversially, a new Fugitive Slave Act requires Northern citizens to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, making every American complicit in the institution they claim to oppose. The Fugitive Slave Act transforms the slavery question from an abstract moral issue into a concrete political reality for millions of Northerners who had never directly encountered the institution. Suddenly, they're required by federal law to participate in what many consider a moral abomination. The Underground Railroad becomes more active and more openly defiant. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that brings the realities of slavery into Northern parlors and transforms public opinion through the power of narrative. The personal becomes political in ways that reshape American culture and politics. The reform movements of the antebellum period don't just challenge specific policies or institutions. They challenge the fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization that have governed American society since its founding. If all people are truly created equal, if they possess unalienable rights regardless of race or gender, then American society must be transformed in ways that the founders never imagined. The California gold rush that begins in 1849 accelerates all of these changes by compressing decades of development into a few frantic years. San Francisco grows from a sleepy village to a booming city almost overnight. Fortune seekers from around the world converge on the gold fields, creating a society unlike anything America has ever seen. Traditional hierarchies collapse in the face of sudden wealth and opportunity. A former slave might strike it rich while a Harvard graduate goes bankrupt. Success depends not on family background or formal education, but on luck, persistence, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The gold rush also reveals the environmental costs of American expansion and development. Hydraulic mining strips away entire hillsides, turning rivers muddy and poisoning fish. Forests disappear to feed the sawmills that supply lumber for the growing cities. Native American communities that have survived Spanish colonization and Mexican rule are destroyed by the influx of American miners and settlers. Progress comes at a price that few Americans are yet willing to calculate, but the energy and optimism of the gold rush era captures something essential about American character in the mid-19th century. This is a people convinced that anything is possible, that the future will be better than the past, that individual effort and democratic institutions can solve any problem. The failures and contradictions are real, but so is the genuine belief that America represents something new and hopeful in human history. The presidential election of 1852 seems to confirm that the Compromise of 1850 has resolved the major issues facing the nation. Franklin Pierce, a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, wins decisively on a platform of national unity and continental expansion. The Whig Party, torn apart by internal divisions over slavery, essentially collapses as a national organization. For a brief moment, it appears that American democracy has successfully navigated its greatest crisis and emerged stronger than ever. But beneath the surface calm, the forces that will tear the nation apart are already gathering strength. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opens the possibility of slavery in territories previously closed to it, reignites all the old controversies and creates new ones. The Republican Party emerges as a sectional organization dedicated to preventing the expansion of slavery, while Southern Democrats become increasingly militant in defending their peculiar institution. The violence that erupts in Kansas territory provides a preview of what's to come when democratic processes break down and political differences become irreconcilable. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flood into Kansas, each side determined to control the territorial government and shape its future. Elections are stolen, towns are burned, and neighbors turn against neighbors in a conflict that earns the territory the nickname Bleeding Kansas. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 represents the logical endpoint of this escalating violence. Brown, convinced that slavery will never be ended through peaceful means, attempts to spark a slave rebellion by seizing a federal arsenal and distributing weapons to enslaved people. The raid fails, and Brown is captured, tried, and executed. but his willingness to die for the cause of emancipation makes him a martyr to many Northerners and a terrorist to most Southerners. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggers the final crisis that the founders had hoped their system would prevent. Lincoln doesn't win a single electoral vote in the Deep South, and his victory represents the triumph of a purely sectional party committed to policies that Southerners consider intolerable. For the first time since the Constitution was ratified, a significant portion of the American people conclude that they can no longer live under the same government as their fellow citizens. South Carolina secedes from the Union in December 1860, followed by 6 other states before Lincoln even takes office. They form the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president and asserting their right to govern themselves according to their own principles and interests. The American experiment in self-government, which began with 13 colonies declaring independence from Britain, now faces the possibility that it will fragment into competing nations, each claiming to represent the true meaning of American democracy. And so we reach the quiet end of this long journey through time, this gentle wandering through the story of how 13 small colonies became something unprecedented in human history. We've followed the thread from those first stirrings of discontent in 1763 to the Great Crisis of 1860, watching as ordinary people discovered they could govern themselves, could create something new in the world, could build a nation on the radical idea that power flows from the people upward, not from kings downward. The experiment that began with a declaration of independence was never really finished, never really complete, always becoming something more than what its founders imagined. Rest now in the knowledge that this story continues, that the gentle rhythm of democracy still beats in the quiet moments when people choose to participate in the endless work of freedom.